Welcome back to Ethics in Physical Activity and Health. Today's topic are going to be some select contemporary issues in healthcare, of course. So this would mean, items that are semi-new or popular right now, or again, um, items that are going to be very hot as the years progress. So these are select issues. There are certainly more, and I hope you are recognizing the just vast amount of cases in healthcare as we go through this session. I think it's pretty clear that humans are pretty complicated creatures. Our needs are varied. We are, of course, very similar in many ways, but we are also very different in many ways. And because of that, the field is always going to be surrounded with controversial issues. And most healthcare professionals won't be faced with controversial topics on a daily basis or regular basis. For a few of the earlier lectures, I've shared with you that, these topics come up and we hear about them. But, I've never, knock on wood, have never been sued. I don't have friends that have had, major issues. But we do have things that do pop up, no doubt. Even if if you never find yourself in the middle of an ethically questionable decision, consider yourself lucky. But I think that it's still important to understand this, considering, like I said, our world. And I know I've mentioned this to you too. Watch the news once a day, and you'll notice it, and you'll see these things pop up. So the first topic that I'd like to discuss or have you think about is stem cell research. Stem cells, you've probably heard of these. Stem cells are undifferentiated cells. And so these cells can become essentially any type of cell in the body. And, for lack of a better physiology explanation, that's kind of how you begin. So these undifferentiated cells are found in embryos and can self-replicate. And that's kind of how you get built. And so, you have a group of stem cells that are going to be liver. You have a group of stem cells that are going to be kidney, and so on and so forth. And so these are very, very powerful cells, and potentially revolutionary in terms of their ability to become any type of cell that we may need. So the sources, besides, obviously you started out as these cells, sources of stem cells include bone marrow. So bone marrow can create stem cells, umbilical cord blood, and then embryos created by in vitro fertilization. So like I said, this is kind of thought of, let's just go to each one of these and then we'll talk about the issues. Why would we want to use stem cells? Well, certainly if these cells can become any type of cell, potentially then we may be able to replace cells or repair cells. And there's then a lot of hope to find cures for diseases. And we're doing this now. There's lots of stem cell research going on. We are, not me personally, but even in this area, there are researchers that are using stem cells to treat knee injuries. But stem cells, if you can become any kind of cell, theoretically we could use these cells as therapeutic treatment for debilitating injuries. Spinal cord injuries was actually one of the first thoughts about these stem cells, or birth defects. Even treating leukemia and multiple sclerosis, because multiple sclerosis it's a autoimmune disease where the myelin sheath becomes destroyed on your neurons. So if we can build myelin sheath again on those neurons, then potentially we can treat MS. So there's a lot of potential here. And these have been around, or at least the thought of these, well, these have always been around, but using these in research now has been around for a couple of decades, but they can be controversial. Even though there are 3 sources, bone marrow, umbilical cord blood, and embryos that were created because of IVF, the ones that have the greatest potential are actually the embryonic stem cells. So bone marrow and the umbilical cord blood, those are less controversial because they're inconsequential in terms of, if you have a child born and you take and save their umbilical cord blood, that's really not a big problem. Now, it does cost some money to save it if you are saving it for future use. So yes, that is there. The biggest or the most controversial, though, are the embryonic stem cells, because if you'll remember back a couple of lecture slides ago, we talked about IVF, so in vitro fertilization. And so I mentioned to you that during IVF treatments, sperm and egg are joined outside of the womb, and so we fertilize those eggs, and then actually lots are fertilized, and the ones that are considered most viable are the ones that are implanted, and usually several are implanted into a woman's womb, and hopefully one takes. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes more than one take, if you will. But what that leaves then are technically fertilized eggs that have not been implanted in a womb. So those can be quite controversial. They were obviously created to help a woman become pregnant, but they won't be used. The controversy, of course, arises because the embryos themselves do carry the potential for life, but the other argument, or the other side, is these guys that are fertilized will never become a fetus if they are not implanted into a uterus. So they'll not actually grow into a human unless they're used. But obviously I hope you can see the controversy here, because a lot of people believe that once egg and sperm are, or once an egg is fertilized, that is conception and that is the beginning of life. Again, the controversy comes from the fact that a lot of these are not used and they are destroyed. So there you go. And then the kicker is these are the ones that have the most potential for use. So we have to take these from those eggs that have not been used in IVF. So they're already created, but again, if they were implanted, they might end up developing into a fetus. There is no federal law that prohibits the research of stem cells, but of course, this does bring up those arguments of creation and boundaries of life. So when does life begin? But we do fund it, and so as a society, this is going on, and as a society, we are funding it from the federal government. So that's another reason why it may be controversial, because you may not like, for example, that your tax dollars are going to this research if you are very much an opponent of destroying these eggs once they are fertilized. But the kicker is, if these IVF fertilized eggs aren't used for stem cell research, they are destroyed. They are biohazard. I know that sounds cold in some ways, but they're either destroyed or they're used for stem cell research. So there's one, stem cells. Genetic testing is also extremely hot right now as far as contemporary issues. And you may remember that in 2003, researchers completed the Human Genome Project, which was successful in mapping the entire human DNA sequence. Once this happened, it actually opened up lots of possibilities for finding out more about genes and genetics. And let me tell you, this is definitely the immediate future, if not long-term future, of health and medicine. Even within exercise prescription, we are talking about personalized prescriptions based on genetics. We know lots about genetics nowadays that we didn't know before the Human Genome Project. So just 15 years ago, we are finding biomarkers every day. Well, maybe not every day, I'm not doing the research, but pretty regularly that show predisposition to certain conditions, that show, traits that individuals may have, share these same markers. And so there's a lot of potential there. With that potential comes a lot of controversy or risk. But we actually have used this. We've used genetic testing for a long time. And actually, prior even to completion of the Human Genome Project, there were some things that we could do and did. So, for example, I'm sure you've heard of these things. When we match criminals to crime scenes using DNA, clearly that's a use of genetic testing. Paternity can be established through genetic testing, and that happened. That can happen, obviously, prior to 2003. We could do paternity testing, which would mean you are comparing DNA and paternity would be father to child, to make sure, if you will, that that person is their biological father. That has happened in things like custody cases and other types of familial court issues. And where it's kind of going now is helping to determine the possibility of developing diseases. And this is why it's a little bit controversial. Well, it can be very controversial because we are finding out, of course, that yes, you may have a genetic marker for something. You may have a genetic marker. There's a pretty well-known genetic marker for breast cancer. And we can test for that. Just because you have a genetic marker for something does not necessarily mean that you are going to develop that condition or that trait. That means that you have a marker for it. And how all that plays out is still obviously, we still are researching that. It does appear that certain genes are more, I don't want to say more aggressive, but there are certain markers that are you're probably going to get things, and then there are some where you don't know. We also know that, again, through recent research, that even if you have genetic markers for things, the way you live may decide if you develop that disease. So, for instance, if you have genetic markers for cardiovascular disease, this was a research paper I just read a couple weeks ago. If you have a genetic marker for certain cardiovascular diseases, you can actually still prevent that through exercise. So you can do all sorts of things to prevent diseases, even if you have a marker for them. Other times it gets more radical. So sometimes people do preventative things based on genetic testing. For instance, probably one of the most popular or the most well-known was several years ago, Angelina Jolie had a double mastectomy because she did have a very strong marker for breast cancer, and her mother died of breast cancer. So at a young age, Angelina Jolie had this, like I said, several years ago. So she's a young woman. She had this genetic testing done. They have this marker that her mother had, and again died of breast cancer. Anyway, she did a pretty drastic measure and got a double mastectomy. That's pretty drastic considering she may not have ever developed breast cancer. So a controversy is also who pays for it. Clearly, Angelina Jolie has the money to pay for a preventative double mastectomy. Most individuals in our world do not have the extra money to do that kind of dramatic procedure, even if it prevents a disease, right? That's a very hard decision, to pay thousands of dollars to do something that you may not develop. But of course, if you're wealthier, you may have more discretionary funds, and you may decide that it's worth it to you financially or, lifestyle-wise or life-wise to do this procedure. Insurance typically will not pay. Insurance will typically not pay for elective procedures. And just because you have a genetic marker for something does, like I said, not mean you're going to get it. And so insurance will not typically pay for those really drastic procedures. Also, there are some genetic testing controversies because we can screen children in the womb, so before birth or after birth, for certain conditions. And sometimes families decide to, especially if it's very, very early in a pregnancy, if there is something very drastic or a disease that is present with a child, remember that abortion is legal in most states, especially early term abortion. And so there have been individuals who have decided to abort, this is one example, a fetus because they had a debilitating condition or marker. Of course, that's controversial for individuals who do not believe in abortion due to that reason. And then finally, maybe a little bit more dramatic, if you will, example is could this be used for harmful purposes? Eugenics and the Nazis, where they were trying to create their master race. So it wasn't just about extermination of Jewish individuals. They were flat out trying to get rid of all disease and disability for their kind of Aryan master race. Other harmful things. What about if we build these databases with DNA and, people are being identified for certain things based on their genes? Now, we do have a law against that. We do have a law that we haven't talked about called GINA, G-I-N-A, which is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And it says that you can't be discriminated against because of your DNA results or genetic information. So we do have some laws in place to try to protect that from happening, but that's not a guarantee. So there are some controversies surrounding genetic testing, certainly. Organ allocation, I've mentioned this in the previous slide when we talked about the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, and then the act that created the registration process and matching nonprofit. So obviously you know about the fact that organs can be donated from both living and deceased individuals, and there are waiting lists of potential organ recipients, as I mentioned before, and those waiting lists it's not just a line. You are definitely placed on these waiting lists. because of your age and your health conditions. And then you may not receive, you have to also match the right conditions to get the organ. So compatibility, meaning, I used this example before, is obviously they're going to try to find a match for you, because we cannot transplant organs that do not match your blood type or your size. The example I gave you where the child received adult lungs that were rejected, and then she received a second set. So there are many things that can be controversial about getting placed on the list, where you get placed, and then if you receive it. An example, or here's some examples that do pop up. Individuals paying for organs. There is a black market. I don't know much about it, but there is a black market for organ donation. There are people who will attempt to make matches and will solicit individuals for matches. So let's say you can get someone to donate directly to you also. And so this often happens between family members or friends of friends. Just because you're on the organ transplant list, you can still go out and find your own, for lack of a better term. So if your brother has a kidney that will work potentially for you, he can decide that it goes to you. There are other than ways, so you will see potentially, people looking for matches or having matching services happening. Also, location and opportunity can be controversial because, and I'll just give you examples of this, wealthier potential individuals may be able to get on a plane and go somewhere where an organ is available, where individuals who do not have financial means or opportunity to do that would not get an organ just simply because they can't get there. And that has actually happened before. His name is totally escaping me right now. Oh my goodness, the Apple CEO that had liver cancer or pancreatic cancer. And he actually he had a private jet, and he actually received an organ because he was able to jump on his private jet. Steve Jobs had a private jet and was able to be matched to somebody and was able to fly there when an organ became available. And then last selection, if you will, for today are tissue samples. If you go in for a medical procedure and you agree to the medical procedure, then once that blood or tissue sample is taken, it actually becomes the organization's property. Like I said, if you've consented to that or you've implied consent by rolling up your arm for a blood sample, but organizations will actually make you do written things now. But it does become the organization's property. And so it is legal for that organization to do whatever they like with that blood and tissue sample. It can be used for research. It can be used for profit. Now, let me also tell you this, though. Most of the time, organizations do not care about your blood or your tissue that they had to take, right? So when I say tissue, an example would be you had like a benign mass that was removed from your shoulder. And they take out this benign mass of cells, and, most of the time, it's thrown away. It goes into biohazard. But sometimes, in unique situations, cells have been used for research or for profit. Nowadays, or at least what I read about most, is that individuals with very rare diseases are the ones that this happens to. Probably the most famous case, and it became very popular in the last 5 years, was the Henrietta Lacks case. So click on those links and explore. Henrietta Lacks, though, was a black woman in the 1950s. She died of cervical cancer in 1952 or 51, I believe. And she received treatment at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Like I said, she was black, and she had to go to Johns Hopkins because it was the only hospital that had that allowed black individuals to receive treatment that was close to her, at least. There were other facilities that were doing that, but they had segregated wards, and so they treated black people, and they treated poor people too. And so she was able to go to Johns Hopkins to receive cancer treatment. It was a very aggressive form of cervical cancer. And very long story short, when they took a sample of her cells, they were noticing that these cells replicated like nothing they'd seen before and could live outside the body for an extended period of time. Prior to Henrietta Lacks's cells, these are cancer cells, prior to these cells, any samples that were taken, the cells died within hours of being outside the body. But for some reason, her cells, her cancer cells, they were so aggressive, they could live pretty much anywhere. Because of this, and it's the 1950s, this research is very young, they used her cells for hundreds of things because they could live outside the body. So they developed the polio vaccine using her cells. They took her cells to space before they put humans in space. They have done so much with her cells because this line lives. You can buy, actually, a vial of HeLa cells. They're called HeLa, H-E-L-A, because of her initials. You can buy a vial of HeLa cells for actually relatively cheap online and use them for whatever you want. So the controversy obviously came because they don't know. There's some debate on whether there was actually any consent given. There is an account of Henrietta Lacks verbally giving consent, but that cannot be proven. Obviously, she died in 51 or 52, 51, I think. Anyways, her family was not notified. So she had children, she was married, she was young when she died. I believe she was 30 to 32 years old. She was very, very young, had 5 children. Years later, her case came to light. People had heard about her before, but I really do think within the last 15 years, Rebecca Skloot, she wrote a book and has really brought this case back to the forefront for us. And then Oprah picked it up, of course. And there is a movie, an HBO movie, I think it's HBO, that Oprah did and starred in that is okay. I've seen the film. It's okay. The book, if you're interested in this case, is much, much better. So there's your link there. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. I read this book far before I ever taught this class. I actually read it for fun because it sounded like an interesting case. And it is an interesting case. It was an interesting woman. And it's real. And anyways, like I said, the controversies come around several things. Her race, her socioeconomic status, being poor, taking things without consent or questionable consent, using it for profit, because there was a whole company, obviously, that was using it for profit, using it for research. People were passing these around, actually. There's a story about these researchers who would give out a vial of HeLa cells to anyone who wanted them. So they just give them out. And then the fact that her family didn't know about it and has never profited from the purchase of her cells. So many, many controversies around this case, and it is fascinating and it is interesting, and I can't recommend it more to you. It is a book that you could read, at night. Like I said, I read it for fun. I highly recommend that you pick this guy up because it's a good one. So there you go. There's 4 selections of controversial, or I shouldn't say controversial, they are controversial, contemporary issues in health. So make sure that you check out some of those links that I've put in this slideshow and check out the Henrietta Lacks case. I think you'll really find it fascinating. And as always, take care of yourselves.